An alien agent is sent to monitor and collect human genetic samples, but when she comes into close contact with her target, a reclusive Earth engineer, she begins to experience something her race has never understood: true emotions. It started with a blink, a shift in the sky that no one else saw, a ripple in the veil of clouds over the western ridge of the abandoned mining planet known only as PX-47 to humans but as Ravok's scar to those who remembered what had once bled from its core. To Lyra of Zerathia, it was simply the location of her next assignment, a mission coded with sterile precision into the back of her ocular implant. Observe. Extract. Report. No contact beyond necessity. The directive was simple because the human was supposed to be simple, just one man, isolated, a relic of a collapsing civilization. But when her pod slid silently into the canyon's shadow and scanned the coordinates etched into the rock face by atmospheric memory, something shifted inside her, something not accounted for in any Zerathian protocol. His name was Finn. Human male, early 30s, exo-engineer specializing in cryonic propulsion systems, registered as deceased by his own people after the incident at Keelos Gate. She had reviewed the dossier 3 times during descent, memorized the asymmetry of his bone structure and the way his eyes, according to one surviving image, had the peculiar hue of copper burned too long in open air. That image didn't prepare her for the reality. He wasn't supposed to be beautiful. He wasn't supposed to be alive in that way. Not in the way that made her lungs contract despite the adjusted atmosphere, not in the way that made her grip tighten slightly on the frost-coated edge of her cloak as she watched him through the visor of her camouflage field. He was welding something beneath the half-buried arch of a collapsed shuttle wing, his back turned to her, heat shimmer dancing around him like ghosts that hadn't realized they were dead. She knew this scene. She had trained in it. She had passed simulations with scores above percentile number .98. But none of those simulations had accounted for the sound of him humming to himself, a low, human melody that vibrated into her chest as if the planet itself remembered music. She blinked. Again. Harder. Accessed her briefing. Target is non-hostile. Proceed with covert observation. Collect sample during sleep cycle. Avoid emotional engagement. But emotional engagement was not something you avoided when you didn't understand what it was. Zerathians were bred without it. Clarity was survival. Love was myth. Lust was classified as a neural misfire, a gene defect purged generations ago. But standing there, invisible and trembling slightly under the frost, she realized something was wrong. With her. She was designed to mimic human affect for undercover operations, to respond with approximations of curiosity and empathy. But this wasn't simulation. This wasn't programming. This was her, standing on alien ground, staring at an alien man, and feeling her chest burn. She should have reported it. Should have activated recall. But she didn't. She watched him finish his work, watched him wipe his brow with the sleeve of a patched flight jacket and sigh like someone who carried an entire planet on his back. Then he turned, and the sun caught his face, and she realized the image in the file was an insult to the reality. He looked haunted, yes, but not broken. Not yet. His eyes scanned the horizon like he sensed something out there. Like he sensed her. She froze, pulled back behind the thermal camouflage of the ravine wall, breath caught like a trap in her throat. He didn't move toward her, but he did frown, and that frown etched something onto her neural core she couldn't delete. That night, she made her approach. Protocol dictated minimal contact, administer sleep gas through ventilation system, extract skin cell or blood sample, depart. But the shuttle was sealed tighter than a Zerathian vault, and the filtration array bore his handiwork, layers of human stubbornness engineered into steel. So she broke another rule. She knocked. Gently. Like she had every right to be there, like she was just another wanderer stranded in the void. The door didn't open at first. Then it hissed, slowly, reluctantly. The second night she returned, it was not because of the mission, not because of the signal buried in her skull that pulsed like a metronome whispering the urgency of failure, but because she could still feel the warmth of his hand on hers long after she had slipped back into the canyon, cloaked again beneath a veil of Zerathian optics, and that warmth had nested somewhere inside her, a dangerous seed that her people had long since evolved beyond, or at least claimed to, but that now blossomed in her chest with every passing second she spent away from him. And so she came back, not as a spy or a collector or a hunter, but as something that had no name in her language, something that trembled as she approached the shelter and saw light still glowing through the cracks in the steel panel walls, and her breath hitched as she stepped closer, her boots crunching against the frost-dusted gravel, though she made no sound, and for a moment she simply stood there, watching the outline of him moving within, a shadow wrapped in flame and metal, before she deactivated the veil, lowered the mask, and knocked again, not because she needed to, but because some part of her wanted him to choose to open the door, wanted it to be his decision, and this time he opened it faster, his shirt unbuttoned at the top, his collar bonds catching the glow of the work light behind him, his hair messier than before, and his eyes narrowing only slightly before relaxing into something almost like recognition. Or maybe it was just a reflection of the confusion in her own gaze, because he didn't speak right away, just stepped aside and gestured her in like she belonged, and the moment she crossed the threshold, the temperature surged through her body like a tide, chasing away the cold that clung to her suit, but leaving something hotter in its place, something she did not have protocols for, something she did not have training for, something that made her lips part slightly and her breath catch when he moved past her and brushed against her arm, not deliberately, but enough to short-circuit her thoughts for a full 2 seconds before she recovered, or pretended to, and when he handed her the same metal cup again, filled with the same foul liquid, she drank it this time without grimacing, because the way he watched her made her feel like every motion mattered, like the tilt of her head or the angle of her fingers was being studied not for weakness but for some mysterious answer he was hoping she would give without speaking. And the silence between them grew thicker, not awkward, not empty, but full of charged air, the kind she had read about in forbidden data files, the kind that preceded storms or confessions or contact. And when he finally said, "You're not just looking for someone," she didn't deny it, she just looked at him and said, "No," and his jaw tensed slightly, but his eyes never left hers as he asked, "Then what are you really doing here?" And she didn't have a lie ready. Didn't have a clean cover story or a rerouted memory burst from command, so she gave him the only truth that didn't end the night, the only one that didn't destroy whatever strange thread had begun to tie itself between them, and she said, "I didn't expect to feel anything," which wasn't an answer, not really, but it was enough, because he exhaled slowly and sat down on the edge of the low cot near the wall, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely, looking at the floor like it held more answers than she did. And when he finally looked back up, there was something raw in his voice, something human and tired and too close to what she was afraid of, as he said, "No one comes out here by accident, not anymore, not with what this place is," and she didn't move, didn't blink, because she could feel the wave building beneath her skin, that heat again, that terrible ache of presence that was not part of her mission but had become impossible to ignore. And then he asked, "Are you dangerous?" And this time she smiled, not coldly, not as a reflex, but soft and real, because she didn't care. The morning after did not begin with sunlight or birdsong, because this was PX-47, and the sky above them was a churning veil of metallic ash and ice, and the only creatures that made noise were the ones smart enough to stay buried. So it began instead with silence, the kind that holds its breath after something irreversible has occurred, the kind that vibrates through skin like memory. And when Lyra opened her eyes, she was not prepared for the way it felt to be held, to wake with her leg tangled over his, her face pressed against the warmth of his bare chest, and for a second she forgot who she was supposed to be, forgot about Zerathia, about protocols, about the mission thread still pulsing silently in her neural spine like a parasite trying to remind her of its claim, because all she could register was the steady rise and fall of his breath and the way his hand unconsciously moved up to rest on her back, fingers splayed over the curve of her spine like a promise he never meant to speak aloud, and it terrified her, because nothing in her training had ever warned her what it would feel like to want to stay, to ache at the idea of leaving, to want to protect instead of extract, and so she did not move, not even when he stirred and murmured her name again, soft and half asleep, not even when he smiled without opening his eyes, as if her presence was the most natural thing in the world, but the illusion shattered the moment the proximity alarm screamed from his console and they both jolted upright, instincts snapping into motion, his hand already reaching for a weapon stashed beneath a bench while she activated the reflex implants in her palms, glowing circuits flaring to life beneath her skin, and he looked at her then, really looked, saw the flicker of alien light in her eyes, the sharp precision in her movements, and something shifted in his expression, a split-second ripple of realization that she knew would lead to questions she wasn't ready to answer, but there was no time, because outside the shelter, across the ridge, a low-frequency hum began to rise, one she knew too well, one that turned her blood cold with recognition, and she didn't need a scan to confirm it. She knew that sound, the mechanical breath of a Zerathian reconnaissance drone, a hunter class, cloaked, designed for biological capture and extraction, which meant one thing, her cover had slipped, or worse, someone had traced her neural signal and sent the drone to collect both her and the target. And Finn was no longer just a curious anomaly in a file, he was now an unauthorized variable in a live extraction zone, and that meant he was disposable, and that thought snapped her fully into motion as she grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the back exit, her voice sharper than she intended, saying we have to go now, and he didn't argue, not yet, not until they were sprinting through the narrow pass behind the ridge, the frozen air slicing across their skin. And he shouted over the wind, what the hell is going on? And she answered with the only truth she could afford, they found me, and he stared at her, eyes wide, mouth parted, and asked, who are you really? But before she could respond, the first blast hit the ground behind them, not an explosion but a kinetic pulse meant to disable, and she stumbled but kept moving, dragging him toward the cave system she had mapped on her first day, her thoughts racing as she calculated probabilities, escape vectors, and betrayal protocols. Because she knew what came next, the drone would deploy immobilizer foam, then scan for genetic targets, and if they were captured together, he would be tagged as a contaminant and dissected, and she couldn't let that happen, not to him, not now, not after everything, so she made a choice, one that would mark her as rogue, as broken, and as they ducked into the narrow cave, she turned to face him and said, you have to trust me, and before he could protest, she pressed her hand against the side of his neck and injected a microbarrier of adaptive face shielding, a restricted Zer. The next day began with a poorly reheated protein cube, 2 mugs of something that might have once resembled coffee, and the kind of silence that could only be described as emotionally flammable, because while they had narrowly avoided being vaporized by a hunter drone, erased their trail, and shared both a kiss and a betrayal in the same 24-hour cycle, neither of them quite knew what to say now that the adrenaline had burned off and the awkward normalcy of not being actively hunted had crept back in, and Lyra, who had trained for over a decade in maintaining a neutral presence in even the most volatile diplomatic scenarios, now found herself standing barefoot in his tiny makeshift kitchen wrapped in an oversized thermal blanket while Finn stood shirtless and scowling at a malfunctioning heating coil like it had personally insulted his mother. And the tension in the room was so thick she could probably slice it with one of his improvised alloy knives, which, incidentally, was currently being used as a spoon for his breakfast, because apparently nothing in this outpost was ever used for its original purpose, and when he glanced over at her and muttered, well, I hope your people don't have a rule about not eating irradiated rations with humans, she blinked, then laughed. Mostly because the alternative was blurting out something tragic like I think I'm in love with you or I may have erased my entire genetic profile to save your life, and instead she just said, only if we mate during the meal, and the way his eyebrows shot up made it worth the awkwardness entirely, and he choked slightly on his next bite before recovering with a smirk and muttering, bold of you to assume I can multitask, which made her smile more than she meant to, and the air between them relaxed just enough to allow breathing, just enough to feel real. But it didn't last, because as soon as the temperature regulation kicked in and the lights stopped flickering, a high-pitched whine emerged from the corner of the room and they both froze, heads snapping toward the panel where the old COMM scanner was lighting up like a Christmas tree, which was not a reference she fully understood but knew from cultural immersion files was bad, and Finn swore under his breath and lunged for it, slapping the controls until the static resolved into a broken, looping signal. Garbled words and strange clicks embedded between fragments of what sounded like a human voice and an alien data burst. And Lyra stepped closer, frowning, her fingers brushing the edge of the console as she said softly, "That's a layered code, voice print over bio authentication," and Finn muttered, "Yeah, I figured that out when it tried to melt my eardrums," and she tapped a sequence into the auxiliary pad, activating a decoding protocol that would have gotten her dismantled back home, and suddenly the signal cleared just enough to play one broken phrase, not from Zerathia and not from Earth Command, but from something older, rusted, and buried, the voice trembling with distortion as it repeated, "Protocol fracture confirmed, payload integrity compromised, all survivors, unknown," and the words were like a punch to the gut because Lyra recognized the voice, not the content, but the pattern, the cadence, and it wasn't human, it was hybrid, Zerathian vowel structures with human consonant bleed, which should not exist unless someone had already been here before her, someone like her, and Finn must have seen her expression shift because he leaned closer and said, "You know something," and she nodded slowly, eyes locked on the console, and whispered, "I'm not the first," and he said, "The first what?" and she said, "The first sent to make contact," and the implication hung in the air like frost, because if she wasn't the first, then where were the others, and why hadn't Zerathia told her, and why had the signal used the phrase protocol fracture, which was not standard Zerathian reporting language but a classified emergency designation, one reserved for failed bio-experiments or rogue agents, and Finn was hot. The darkness that fell inside the forgotten chamber was not empty but full, as if the walls themselves had inhaled and were now holding their breath, and Lyra stood frozen in a stillness, her mind racing as the voice that had spoken her long-erased designation echoed faintly into silence, and Finn reached for her hand instinctively, his fingers brushing hers with a grounding steadiness that pulled her back to the moment, and she let him take it, let the warmth of his skin push away the cold whisper of the unknown as they stood there together in the center of something that should not have remembered her, and yet clearly did, and for a long stretch of minutes neither of them moved, listening to the faint hum of power still thrumming beneath the metal floor like the heartbeat of a buried titan, and then Finn said softly, "This place gives me the creeps," and she nodded, unable to form words yet, because her pulse was loud in her ears and the air tasted like secrets, and he added, "I know we need answers, but maybe we take a minute, just a minute, to breathe," and she looked at him then, really looked, at the man who had opened the door for a stranger, who had saved her when he should have run, who had held her when she broke protocol and again when she broke down, and something in her cracked with quiet relief, because he was here, alive and real, and nothing else in this haunted place could take that from her, and she stepped forward without thinking, closing the distance between them, her hands rising to touch his face, and he did not flinch, did not pull away, he just looked at her like he had been waiting for her to decide, and when she kissed him it was not desperate or hurried like before but slow, deliberate, a confirmation of something that had already taken root in both of them, and his arms slid around her back with practiced ease, drawing her in, and their bodies fit together in a way that felt inevitable, like gravity and fire, and when her fingers found the hem of his shirt and pushed it upward, he let her, pulling it over his head and tossing it aside without breaking the kiss, and she traced the planes of his chest, the scars, the warmth, the slight tremble that passed through him as she moved lower, and he caught her wrist gently and looked into her eyes with a soft, amused smile and said, "Are you sure this is the right moment for this?" And she smiled back and said, "Nothing about us has ever happened at the right moment," and he laughed and kissed her again, this time deeper, his hands moving with more confidence now, one sliding into her hair, the other skimming the small of her back as they backed toward the only intact panel of wall, her body pressing against it with a thud that echoed gently through the ancient space, and her breath caught as he kissed down the line of her jaw, her neck, and she tilted her head to give him more room, her hands finding the fastenings of her outer layer and releasing them one by one, until the cool air kissed her skin, and his hands followed, reverent and slow, learning her like a map he wanted to memorize by touch, and when she gasped quietly into his mouth he smiled again, and whispered, "You sound like starlight," and she didn't know what that meant but it made her chest ache in the best way, and she pushed her hips against him, feeling the heat between them rise like a solar flare, unstoppable and blinding, and when he finally pulled the rest of her uniform away, letting it fall to the floor with a soft whisper, he paused to look at her, not just her body, but her, and she felt seen in a way she never had before, not catalogued, not scanned, but understood, and she reached for him, pulling him down to the ground with her, the metal cool against her back, his weight warm and solid and welcome, and their movements slowed again, unhurried, explorative, as if they had all the time in the world, even though both of them knew that was a lie, and when he entered her it was with care, his breath catching in her ear, his hands steadying them both, and she arched into him with a sigh. They didn't speak as they descended deeper into the structure, their hands still loosely joined, their footsteps careful on the worn metal stairs that creaked beneath centuries of dust and silence, and though the air grew colder and the shadows darker with each level they passed, the warmth between their bodies lingered like a shield, and Lyra could still feel the echoes of what they had just shared pulsing beneath her skin, grounding her in a way no protocol ever had, and Finn moved with that same quiet alertness he always did, like someone used to walking between moments of violence and stillness, but now his movements were softer, touched by the trust they had built with breath and body, and yet even as the intimacy of the last hour wrapped around them, Lyra could not shake the feeling that something had shifted, not in them, but in the facility itself, something unseen watching from beneath the layers of steel and rust, something not just aware of their presence, but invested in it, and that unease sharpened when they reached the final platform, a circular space domed in fractured glass that looked out into nothing but rock and blackness, yet still hummed with a low electric vibration, and in the center of the room stood a single pedestal, half buried in debris, its surface glowing faintly with an alien blue she recognized from training modules she was never supposed to have accessed, and she stepped toward it cautiously, her breath hitching when the console lit up in response to her proximity, lines of code flickering across its surface in both Zerathian script and ancient Terran binary, merging in patterns that should not have been possible, and Finn moved to her side and asked quietly, "What is this place?" And she said, "I think it's a hybrid vault, one of the early experimental sites from before the treaty bans," and he frowned. "You mean a cross-genetics lab? I thought those were outlawed," and she nodded slowly. They were, by both sides, after the first failures, and he asked, "So what does it want with you?" And before she could answer the panel flared brighter and a voice unlike the first crackled through the room, colder and deeper, saying designation Lyra confirmed, integration process at 92%, awakening suspended subject, and she froze, every nerve in her body going stiff as she stared at the pedestal and whispered, "That's not possible," and Finn grabbed her arm, saying, "What the hell does that mean? What subject?" And before she could respond the wall behind them groaned open with a hiss of long-dead hydraulics and a tall stasis chamber emerged from the floor, frost cascading off its surface like mist, and Lyra felt her knees go weak because she recognized what lay inside before the display even cleared. It was her, not a clone, not a mirror, but her, in every detail, her same scar along the temple from a childhood fall, her same breathing pattern, her same dormant neural pulse, and her voice came out broken as she whispered, "That's me," and Finn stared between her and the pod and said, "How is that even possible?" And the voice from the console answered before she could, "Subject 017 active copy confirmed, genetic sync achieved, primary consciousness transfer complete," and then it hit her all at once, a rush of memories that did not belong to her but were buried in her DNA, moments from before she had ever awoken on Zerathia, moments of tests, of scientists in black armor, of humans and aliens alike working together in secret, of experiments not just on her but around her, and she dropped to her knees as the truth poured into her like fire. She wasn't born, she was built, not grown like a soldier, but constructed like a bridge, her entire existence designed to be the missing link between two species locked in cold silence, and the Lyra in the pod was not her twin or her source, it was the original, the first attempt, the template, and she was the second iteration, not just a spy or a soldier but a backup consciousness, a fail-safe, and the mission had never been about extraction or observation. Finn sat up with the expression of someone who had just been hit by an invisible truth and a very real wall, rubbing the back of his head while staring at the glowing projection from his wrist like it had just accused him of something deeply inappropriate and surprisingly accurate, and Lyra was still frozen mid-thought, her arms trembling and her mouth half open as if trying to speak multiple languages at once, none of which were useful in this moment, because she had fallen for someone who, by all available data, might technically be a co-designed hybrid target embedded with genetic triggers linked to her own activation, which meant that their entire relationship might have been orchestrated by a long-dead experiment with a flair for romantic timing. And the worst part was that she could still feel the lingering warmth of his skin on hers and all the soft things he had said and done before everything exploded. And now standing 10 feet away was her stasis fresh original self, looking impossibly calm and impossibly annoying, with perfectly centered posture and the kind of unbothered grace that made Lyra want to throw something, preferably a wrench or maybe just the entire console. And when the projection finally faded back into the device on Finn's wrist, he looked at it like it was a ticking bomb and muttered, "So I'm part of a secret experiment, genetically engineered, raised by accident, fated to meet an alien spy clone girl who just happens to be the key to unlocking some ancient vault system." And Lyra blinked and said, "When you say it like that it sounds crazy," and he deadpanned, "Oh, I'm sorry, should I have added a musical number?" And she almost laughed, except the other Lyra was now circling the chamber like a curious cat who'd been given a very weird puzzle and wasn't quite sure whether to solve it or eat it. And finally she said, "The system was designed to reboot upon mutual proximity of genetically bound elements," and Finn muttered, "Yeah, we definitely got proximal," and Lyra smacked his arm lightly and said, "Not helping," and then added under her breath, "Although kind of fair," and then the original Lyra tilted her head and said, "Emotional bonding accelerates resonance efficiency," and Finn raised a brow and said, "So you're saying that us hooking up made the ancient alien computer happier?" And Lyra covered her face with her hands and said, "Please stop talking forever," but she was also biting back a snort because the absurdity of the situation had reached levels only found in failed comedy holovids and doomed operas. And then the console lit up again with a low pulsing thrum and displayed a rotating double helix, one strand labeled Subject 017 and the other Subject 017A, and Lyra stared at it and whispered, "It's aligning us," and Finn frowned and said, "Aligning like syncing or aligning like mating?" And she turned scarlet and shouted, "Syncing," and the original Lyra said, "Both are technically correct," and that was the exact moment Lyra decided she would kill someone even if it meant strangling herself. And Finn clearly sensed the rising panic because he touched her arm gently and said, "Hey, we're still us, whatever this is. We're still who we were before that thing glowed." And she took a shaky breath and nodded because she wanted to believe that more than anything. And then the console flashed red and a countdown began on the screen, 30 seconds, and Lyra's stomach dropped as she asked, "What's happening?" and the other Lyra looked concerned for the first time and said, "Integration protocol incomplete. External interference detected. Initiating lockdown." And Finn groaned and said, "That's never good." And before any of them could react, the door slammed shut and gas hissed from the vents overhead. And Lyra grabbed Finn's hand and pulled him under the console table, shouting, "Hold your breath," and they crouched there in the flickering light, coughing, eyes watering, while the original Lyra remained standing with serene detachment, apparently unaffected by the gas, which was extremely unfair and possibly the most annoying thing Lyra had ever. The air outside the vault was different when they finally emerged, thinner and sharper, as if the planet itself had been holding its breath while they were inside and was now exhaling slowly around them. And Lyra stood at the threshold for a moment longer than Finn, her eyes lingering on the horizon where the twin suns had begun to rise behind the skeletal cliffs, casting long shadows that stretched across the broken ground like memories reaching for something just out of sight. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she let herself breathe without urgency, without the weight of a mission or a signal pinging in the back of her skull or the cold logic of a system telling her what she was meant to be. And when she turned to look at him, at Finn, who had by some impossible twist of fate been written into her genetic history and her heart in equal measure, he was already watching her with that lopsided grin of his, the one that said he was tired and sore and probably thinking about food, but also quietly amazed they were still alive. And she crossed the distance between them in a few quick steps and wrapped her arms around him, not because she needed comfort, but because it was the most honest thing she could do. And he held her back, strong and sure, like they had not almost just been erased by an ancient experiment or forced to fight versions of themselves they didn't even know existed. And when she pulled away just far enough to rest her forehead against his, he whispered, "So what now?" And she smiled and said, "Now we decide who we are." And he laughed and said, "Great, but I'm deciding from a bed, a real one, with pillows." And she laughed too, the sound cracking something open in her chest, something soft and tender that had once been sealed shut by duty and silence. And together they walked back through the ravine, past the fractured sensor posts and half-buried cables that no longer led anywhere, back to the shelter that had somehow become more than a hiding place. More than a structure, back to the space that had first held them both in all their broken humanity and unexpected connection, and when they reached the door it slid open without hesitation, welcoming them like an old friend, and they stepped inside to find the mess exactly as they had left it. Tools scattered across the bench, data pads blinking with forgotten alerts, and the two mugs still sitting side by side near the heating coil, and Finn made a face at the cold beverage and said, "If this thing ever brews real coffee I'm marrying it." And Lyra raised an eyebrow and said, "You already proposed to me with a blanket and ration cubes," and he shrugged and said, "I'm very romantic," and she laughed again because somehow the world ending and beginning all over again had not changed how ridiculous and perfect he could be. And as she watched him move through the space, fussing with a cracked screen and muttering about how terrible the interface was, she realized something terrifying and wonderful all at once, that she could see herself doing this forever, not saving the galaxy or redefining two civilizations, but just living, here, with him. And it was not the ending she had been trained for or the one she had feared, but it was real and it was hers. And over the next few days they worked together to seal off the vault entrance, not to hide it forever, but to keep its systems dormant until someone, somewhere, was ready to face what had been created there. And Lyra left behind a single encrypted note in Zerathian and English combined, a message that read, "Let us be the last to be programmed, let those after us choose for themselves," and then they left it behind, not with regret but with the solemnity of people who had lived through something too big to carry with them. And with each passing day Lyra found herself waking with fewer alarms in her head and more curiosity in her heart, and Finn found himself smiling more often, even when the heating unit refused to cooperate or the gravity compensator wobbled in the night and dumped them both out of bed. And when she finally